Welcome to the Back to Life podcast, where we explore living well, loving well, and being well. I'm your host, Nicole, and I invite you to tune in for inspirational conversations to get you back to life. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Back to Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole, and today we are beginning a powerful 3-part series called Why Me? We're going to explore how to navigate suffering and find purpose in hardship. And today we're kicking off this series with a topic that every single person will experience at some point in their life, and that's grief and loss. But here's the thing. Grief isn't just about death. It shows up in all kinds of ways. Whether we're losing a version of yourself, saying goodbye to a job, moving away from a place you call home, friendships fading, kids growing up and moving out, and even losing a beloved pet. So joining me today is my guest co-host for this series, licensed professional clinical counselor, Angela Barela. She's back with me again to help us unpack the mental health side of grief.
Hey, Nicole, thanks for having me back. Yeah. I'm looking forward to diving into this with you.
Yeah, this is going to be good. And we are also honored to have Elizabeth Ross, a representative from Compassus, a national leader in compassionate hospice care, joining us today for this first episode of the series. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm really grateful that you're allowing me to be part of this conversation. We talk a lot about grief. Most people immediately think they're about losing a loved one. And while that is a profound form of grief, loss comes in so many shapes and forms. So what's important to know is that grief is a natural emotional response to change or loss of something meaningful. One of my favorite quotes that I use in hospice all the time is, "Grief is love with no place to go."
Oh, I love that.
And that's a quote from Jamie Anderson.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Grief is a response to change. And those quotes are so wonderful. Because we don't often realize that even expected changes can bring grief. Like, when both of my daughters grew up and became more independent, I was so proud. And I still am, But I also felt this quiet sadness. Like, wait, they don't need me anymore?
Yeah. Oh, that's a horrible feeling.
It is. But you know what? My girls, like I said, it's not like they're like whisked away, going away to a far away land or anything. I still have contact with. It's just that they're grown now. They're not like 5. They're not 12.
Yeah.
They're adult women.
That's true.
Yeah.
And there's actually a name for that.
Okay.
It's called ambiguous grief.
Okay.
So that's when we're grieving something that's not actually a death.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But it still feels like a loss.
Yes.
It could be a divorce, a friendship that drifts apart, grieving a younger version of yourself. It's complicated, but it's definitely a real feeling and a real part of grief.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's very real. So today we're going to tackle a universal human experience, which is grief and loss. And while many, like we talked about before, we, associate grief primarily with death, we want to expand that conversation. And we're going to explore different types of loss, how it manifests in our life, and most importantly, how we can navigate these challenging waters with compassion for ourselves and for others.
That's good.
Yeah.
And also throughout this conversation, we definitely want to emphasize that wherever you are in your journey with grief, there's hope. Even when you feel like you're in your darkest moments, there's always a path forward.
Oh, yeah. So, Elizabeth, as someone who works in hospice care, you've witnessed grief in its rawest forms. Could you help us understand what grief actually is?
Sure. Grief is our natural response to loss. It's not just an emotion. It's a very complex process. It affects us in every way, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing to understand is that grief is deeply personal. I often tell people it is as individual as the person experiencing it. Yeah. There's no right or wrong way to grieve.
Yeah.
It's never going to be the same from person to person.
Yeah.
When we think about grief in the context of death, which is where I spend a lot of my professional life, we see incredible variation. Some people experience intense emotions immediately, while other people tell you, I don't feel anything yet. am I supposed to feel something? And
Yeah.
sometimes we have to really comfort them with the fact that it is something that they are going to experience different variations of, even within their own selves.
Mm-hmm.
So many people find comfort in community, while other people need some time alone to process. Again, no wrong way to grieve.
Yeah.
There is no wrong way.
And you know what? That's so important to emphasize, that there's no correct timeline or method for processing grief.
Yeah, it's hard when you're processing it. And, we're all kind of familiar with the 5 stages of grief.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. But what a lot of people don't realize is that you're not going to go through those step by step.
No.
It's going to go up and down. It's you may have denial for a long time and then feel like you're accepting it and then bounce back to anger, then go back. Maybe I'm feeling a little better. You may go out with friends and see, oh, I had a good time, so maybe this is passing. And then, it might jump right back over here into the denial part of it.
Yeah. I think, too, one of the things that I've noticed is that some people experience all 5, some experience a few.
Yeah.
But we all have that in common. We're going to experience some part of that 5 parts of grief.
And it's not in a box. It's completely normal.
Yeah.
And speaking of different forms of grief, one thing we really want to highlight today is that grief isn't exclusively tied to death. Angela, could you talk a little bit more about other significant losses that people experience?
Yes. We experience grief whenever we lose something that's meaningful to us. So it could be an illness that changes your ability to work, a retirement that shifts your identity. It could be watching your parents age, your kids growing up, like you mentioned earlier. It could be a grief from a divorce or a breakup, an end to any significant relationship. Even positive transitions can cause a certain amount of grief, whether you're moving to a new city, you're leaving a community behind. Job loss can trigger profound grief. Especially if our work is tied to our sense of purpose and identity. There's a slow fading of once vibrant friendships. We grow up, we grow apart, things like that. All of these are different kinds of grief that people don't really think about when we think about the term grief.
Yeah. I know we can all, kind of relate to that, because sometimes you don't realize how important these connections are until they're gone.
Yeah, and let's not forget about our pets.
Oh yeah.
That's a good
Our fur babies.
Our fur babies. So for many people, pets are their family members, and anticipating and experiencing their loss can be very devastating.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's aging parents as well, just like I was talking about, your kids growing up, also watching your parents age. I think in my mind, sometimes your parents are always stuck perpetually at 35. You know what I mean? It's like they're not quite 40 or 50, you know what I mean? But they're not like 20 either. It's like they're perpetually like right in the middle.
Yeah.
And then to see them where there's just a little more gray. There's just a little change in the way their hands look, you know what I mean? And sometimes just realizing that can kind of trigger a sense of grief and loss too.
Of course.
Yeah. So, okay. Elizabeth, in your work with families facing end-of-life situations, what are some common grief experiences that you observe?
Sure. One of the things we see very frequently and our team deals with is called anticipatory grief.
Okay.
It's the grief that starts before you actually lose the person, just like you were talking about. That some of what you just said was really anticipating the grief that will come.
Yeah.
It is very common for family members as they watch their loved one decline. I would say with Alzheimer's dementia, we tell people all the time, you've been losing your loved one long before they passed, and you're still there physically caring for the person that they used to be. And so we often have to really, really work with them to understand that. The other thing we see is what we call complicated or complex grief. It's usually occurs because there's been multiple deaths or multiple losses. Maybe they lost a job to take care of their loved one, and then now their loved one's gone, and now they're facing multiple losses. It also can occur when there's a traumatic death, maybe an unexpected loss.
Okay.
So something maybe they didn't expect the secondary loss to come with that death. loss of their dreams, loss of plans, loss of what they thought it was going to look like.
Gotcha.
Yeah. That's really important to point out, the secondary losses that people experience that we actually don't pay much attention to often.
Yeah.
And they often catch people by surprise when they do happen.
Yes.
You know, the loss of identity, future plans, dreams, like you were kind of saying, loss of security, a loss of faith, meaning that,
Yes.
you know, people, we struggle when we're grieving and people don't understand actually what's going on. And, you know, when you come to therapy or something like that, support groups, people can sit down and say, hey, you know, that's a part of grief. You know, questioning your faith, that's a big one. It happens especially during time of grieving. A loss of routine can be a secondary loss, just a loss of self-confidence, self-control.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all of these things are just kind of part of the grieving process and can sometimes extend it.
Yeah.
I love that you brought up the finding meaning, because there's been work done since Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote the 5 stages of grief, and there's actually been a 6th stage added by David Kessler about finding meaning. So working through that grief process to find that meaning within the whole process. So I love that you brought that forward.
Yeah, and you know what, that really leads us into talking about how grief actually affects us. I know from my own experience in grief that it isn't just emotional. It can hit you very physically too.
Yes.
So
yeah, absolutely. Grief isn't just in your head. It kind of lives in your body. And, you know, I take things from a trauma standpoint.
Yes.
Because that's what I work with. And, you know, grief can be very traumatic for a lot of people. And there's a lot of physical symptoms that go along with it. Fatigue, muscle tension, headaches, even some digestive issues. You know, your brain and body are deeply connected. And when we lose someone or something significant, the body reacts as if it's been under long-term stress. And when we experience loss, you know, the body gets stuck in fight or flight, and it can cause a lot of physical issues, brain fog, trouble concentrating. Many people describe grief brain, which is, you know, kind of being distracted, having like a foggy sense of, you know, going day to day. Memory issues are also really, really common. Some people experience depression, anxiety as well. And then, you know, it goes beyond just feeling sad. Some people may develop what's complicated grief, or complex grief, which can become more severe. And, you know, there are certain things to look out for with that. We'll probably talk about that here later on. But, you know, just think about acute grief symptoms intensely over time, and they will interfere with functioning of your day-to-day.
Exactly. I think it's important to normalize these symptoms.
Yes.
Because so many people go through these things and they're just like, something's wrong with me, or other people are putting that like, why are you still, you know, it happened 2 months ago, or something like that. So
yeah. At Compassus, we like to emphasize our care for who I am structure.
Okay.
So when we approach grief, just like when we approach the care of the patient when they're living, we want to look at what that looks like for that person.
Gotcha.
Who they are, not what we think they should be doing, because that is the worst thing you can do with grief.
Ooh, yeah.
A lot of people think grief is crying or being, you know, withdrawn. And I'm sure that's a huge part of it. Yeah. But it really does manifest in your body. You can't sleep. You may not eat. You may eat more. Sleeping too much, struggling with insomnia, those appetite changes, feeling tired all the time, even pain. Physical pain. You know, imagine like you're stressed and you've got your body all tensed. You wake up in the morning and your jaw hurts because you've been clenching all night, those kind of things. And then it starts to affect our immune system.
Oh, yeah.
So you really do have to work to care for yourself. Many people withdraw socially. Others will make themselves really busy with keeping busy, and so that they never have to address the grief. And they kind of go into that avoiding feeling those emotions.
Absolutely. And perhaps we can all relate to that last one, staying busy to avoid dealing with grief or other things.
Yeah.
And yet ignoring it does not make it go away.
Exactly. What's tough is that, society doesn't really always validate these kinds of losses.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
People are like, oh, it's just a job, or it was just a pet. But to us, it could be a deeply personal loss that we are experiencing, and it deserves to be acknowledged.
Agreed.
Yeah. With all these impacts, what should people know about the timeline of grief? There's often pressure to, quote unquote, get over it or move on. And I hate when I hear that.
Oh, me too.
Oh.
Whether you hear somebody else talking, another conversation, or someone saying it to you.
Right.
And hopefully, prayerfully, I've never said that to someone. If I have, I'm sorry. But, it's like, but it's like.
I can't see that.
But just kind of like, oh, just get over it.
Exactly.
When you are hurting and stuff like that, that is one of the worst things you can hear or
Yes.
receive. You know what I mean?
It is. And the pressure to just get over it or move on, it's hurtful and harmful.
Yes.
There's no standard timeline for grief. Everybody's grief is different, and some, takes longer than others. Some aspects of it stay with us forever. We don't just get over it. We just pretty much learn how to hold it in and, keep going in with life. And, there's a quote that says, the reality is that you'll grieve forever.
Right.
You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You just kind of learn to live with it. And I think that kind of explains, how most people deal with grief.
Right? Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
And, what typically happens is that over time, the acute pain becomes less constant.
Right.
The ebb and flow of things kind of slow down. But you may still feel it. It may still arrive intensely at times, especially around anniversaries, birthdays, or special events. And those are just kind of times where you need to bring people around you that can, help you grieve when you need them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in hospice care, we often talk about grief, not as something to overcome, but it is just going to be a reflection of the love you had for that person, like the quote I shared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Grief is love with nowhere to go.
Yeah.
The depth of our grief can correspond to the significance of our attachment. I would also like to say that many, many people, I hear them say, and I think I brought it up earlier, is like, why am I not? Shouldn't I be? Why am I not feeling like crying? Or why am I not in pain? And I think that, again, it goes back to the very intense personal grief process. That may come later.
Yeah.
That may never come. But it really does a lot of times correspond to the significance of that relationship to you and how you worked through it.
Yeah.
It's so important to honor the grief and believe that the grief is there, and it kind of becomes your friend.
Oh.
The thing you sit with, the thing that allows you to develop new ways of being, new ways of existing, new routines that help you honor that grief, but do allow you to move forward. But it comes in its own time.
Yeah. And I think that's hard for a lot of people. I know, with our clients, Angela, wouldn't you agree, to sit with those feelings,
Yes.
especially if they are intense and they are overwhelming.
Right.
It's hard to sit. So, friend, are you kidding me? They're like, no.
I know. No one, it's the friend nobody wants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah. So let's talk about healing. The question on everyone's mind is, how do we cope with grief in healthy ways? Regardless of the source of grief,
Right.
How do we cope with this? Because grief doesn't just disappear overnight.
No.
How do we actually work through it? So, Elizabeth, what advice do you give the families that you work with?
So the first thing I tell everyone is give yourself permission to grieve. Just sit with it again. I encourage people to acknowledge the grief, not avoid it. When we try to bypass it, it's going to find another way out. It will find another way to show up in your world, like physically, spiritually, emotionally. There's no right way to grieve, and there's no timeline. So just let it be what it is. The second is that self-compassion is so crucial.
Yeah.
And this has been a tough one for me, to give myself self-compassion. But it isn't linear. Just like you aren't going to, people think, I'm going to go through stage 1 and then stage 2 and then stage 3. That is not the way it works. You are all over the place. There's a great picture that says what grief people think grief is. And then there's the picture of all the squiggles all over the place.
Kind of like a ball of yarn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't mean you're regressing if you have a day that you're angry when you thought you had made it to an acceptance phase.
Yeah.
You can accept one day and the next day be angry about it again. That's okay.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that you are grieving badly. It just means you're grieving.
Yes.
And third, find ways to honor what you've lost. That can be very healing and help you through the grief process. This may be creating rituals or sharing stories. With hospice, we offer memorial services. We plant trees or flowers or release butterflies. Anything you can do to honor that relationship and that love that you have for the person or the thing you've lost. Sometimes it's our dog, or our cat, or our chickens. We have lots of that going on now. Okay. So there's all sorts of things you can grieve the loss of.
Okay.
I love that.
I know.
And one of the best ways to process grief is through naming and expressing it, whether it's journaling, talking to a friend, even therapy. I think grief, like you were saying, needs an outlet. Grief needs a voice.
Yeah, I love that. And honestly, for me, music helps.
Absolutely.
Certain songs just allow me to feel what I need to feel. It's like sometimes if I'm sad, I'm not necessarily trying to be, depressed or anything.
Right.
It's just that if I know for some people, if they're moving through a lot of fight or flight, and stuff, they can get stuck, and especially in that freeze phase and stuff like that. So it's like music kind of helps to move it through, And so for me, it's like if I listen to a certain song, let's say it's sad, it helps me to feel. And it helps it to flow through instead of just being stuck in that. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great coping tool. That is my go-to for every emotion that I have.
There's a soundtrack for all of our lives,
Nice.
Yes.
There's others that, deep breathing, physical movement, yoga, walking, even creating small little rituals of remembrance, lighting a candle, writing a letter, doing creative art.
Yes.
Art, music, poetry, anything like that is great. Going to therapy, support groups, there's a lot that you can do, and there's a lot out there for people if they're looking for an outlet.
Yeah.
And spiritually, grief can be a challenge to our faith.
Yes.
But it also can deepen our faith. It's okay to wrestle with questions and bring that pain to God.
Yes.
He is not afraid of our sadness.
No, he isn't. And that's such an important reminder. So, ladies, are there particular approaches that seem most helpful for specific types of loss? For instance, is coping with a death different from processing the grief of divorce?
I think while the underlying principles of grief work are very similar, different losses, I think, benefit from specific approaches. With death, I think joining grief support groups can be powerful because it allows you to connect with other people who are truly understand what you're going through. I think with losses like divorce or a major life transition, therapy approaches that help you reconstruct your identity and envision a new future with you can be very important. I think for ambiguous losses, like having a loved one with dementia or who's physically present but psychologically changed, finding ways to maintain a connection is going to be very important. And also acknowledging that change is happening.
Right.
Yeah.
And for anticipatory grief, like caring for someone with a terminal illness, balancing grieving with being present for the time that remains can be a huge challenge.
Yeah.
So support groups specific to caregivers can be invaluable as well.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that seeking professional help isn't a sign of weakness.
Amen.
It's often the most courageous step someone can take. And we're not just saying that because we're therapists. We're just saying that because it really is true. It's like a lot of times we don't realize you just need someone to help you through, to get over the hump, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Grief sometimes can trigger or make certain mental health conditions worse.
Yeah.
Especially depression and anxiety. So if you're finding that grief is severely impacting your ability to function, or you're having thoughts of harming yourself, please reach out to somebody.
Call 988.
Yes. Because even without these more severe symptoms, therapy can provide a dedicated space to help you kind of process a lot of the stuff that you're going through. And it can help you kind of develop a personalized coping and treatment plan to help you with these things.
Absolutely. So let's talk about supporting others through grief. What are some helpful approaches and what should we avoid?
From my perspective, one of the most valuable things you can offer is your presence. Just show up. Many families tell us that their struggle is after everyone's there till the funeral, and then after the funeral, they're suddenly alone, and there's a void. And so I think just showing up is important. Don't try to fix their pain. Don't minimize it. Don't say, oh, well, at least they had a great life, or, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. That's not helpful.
Yeah.
It needs to be witnessed and experienced and acknowledged, the pain that they're having. And remember, what they're experiencing is as individual as who they are.
Yes.
Avoiding platitudes like, everything happens for a reason. Which all is said with really good intent. And so we don't want anyone to think that anyone is just ignoring someone's grief. But
the impact of that.
Yeah, it's very minimizing of the pain that they're experiencing. It's actually not just in the immediate aftermath of their loss either, but in the months that it comes after, so that they can try to resume some sort of normalcy to their life. We don't want to hinder that by minimizing their grief.
Absolutely. And I think also just understanding the difference between what normal grief looks like and kind of when it starts tipping over into something more severe.
Yeah.
Normal grief comes in waves. There's moments of sadness, but moments of relief or even laughter and being okay. Whereas depression feels heavy and persistent and there's no breaks in it. And I think being able to take a step back and educating yourself on what is normal grief and what is when it's becoming too much, and that is for a person, like a family member, a supportive family member, or even the person going through it. And also practical support matters as well. So can I pick up groceries for you? Can I help mow your lawn? Those little things can make such a huge difference, just taking the burden off of somebody's shoulders. And everybody's different. Everybody has different needs. Some want to talk about their loss over and over.
Yes.
And, some want distraction. So I think it's really important just to kind of follow their lead.
Yeah. And when we say, let me know if there's anything you can do, like you said, that's where practical support, it's kind of like, I'm going to go to Costco.
Right. Yes.
Do you need me to, do you need groceries? Do you need this, or just being, because in that, like we were talking about the grief brain.
Yes.
You're like, I don't know. That's the response. I don't know.
Right.
So it's easier to kind of bring it down to, hey, I'm going to bring you some food.
Exactly, especially if there's kids in the household and it was like a death of a parent.
Yes.
That other parent may just not be put together and have it, all together right then and there.
Right.
So being able to say, hey, can I bring some meals over? Can I help with this?
Can I take the kids out for a play day?
Like all of that's really important.
Yeah, and that speaks to how we can support children through grief, because that seems more particularly challenging.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just understanding it as well that children grieve very differently than adults.
Yes.
They tend to move in and out of grief. Sometimes they appear fine, sometimes they have intense emotions. Their understanding of loss evolves as they develop, and especially if this is the first loss that they've ever experienced, they may not know how to grieve, which is where kids kind of learn how to grieve from their parents and the people around them. The most important things are to be very honest with them in age appropriate ways, answer their questions directly. I would say don't try to sugarcoat it, oh, they went to sleep, or, things like that, because that can be very confusing for them.
And scary.
Yes.
Yeah, because they're like, I'm not going to sleep.
I'm not going to sleep.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And, reassuring them about their own security, include them in, rituals of remembrance, while giving them the choice on how they want to participate. They may not feel comfortable going to a viewing or a funeral, and you kind of have to let them figure out what that looks like for them as well.
Make it age appropriate.
Yes. And I think a big one that I have seen in seeing some of my clients is, don't make the kids feel guilty for not expressing grief the way that you do as a parent.
Oh, that's a good one.
You know, the child may not understand what is actually going on, and you may be a complete mess over here. But don't guilt the child because they're not showing the same emotion.
Yeah. And I think modeling that healthy grief is so powerful for kids, because they are going to take a cue from you as the adult on how that's supposed to look. So them seeing that these emotions are natural and that it's okay to be sad and it's okay to be upset will help them as they grow older and learn to grieve appropriately.
Yeah. So as we move towards closing our conversation, let's talk about where hope fits in the grief journey. Go ahead.
So in my work with hospice, almost 30 years now, I've witnessed some remarkable transformations through grief. Hope is very much, it emerges not as an expectation that the pain will disappear, but just that discovery that both can exist together.
Absolutely.
Like the pain and the love and the loss and the joy all are there at the same time. And it's beautiful to watch that come together. Many people find that grief deepens their capacity to connect and have compassion for other people. Sometimes they use it as a springboard to go on and use that in other areas of their life to help others. They become more intentional and slow down and think about what truly matters. Some find meaning in honoring their loved ones and how they lived or how they served others.
Yeah, I see hope as like the understanding that while grief changes us, it doesn't actually have to define us all the time.
I love that.
We are more than our losses, and hope is finding that your capacity for joy hasn't been permanently extinguished, even, you know, sometimes when it feels that way.
Right.
It's also worth noting that post-traumatic growth is a real thing. Many people eventually find that navigating profound loss has helped them develop a sense of resilience and clarity about priorities in their life. It helps them establish a deeper connection in their relationships, and a lot of them will go towards, you know, more of a spiritual growth in their life.
Absolutely. And so, you know, that resonates very deeply with me. My own experiences with losses recently as well as in the past have eventually led to greater appreciation for what remains and then what's possible. Not immediately. Grief takes the time that it takes, you know, but gradually. And so we all move through that.
Exactly. We don't overcome significant losses.
No.
They are our story. They're part of our story.
Absolutely.
But they're not the whole story.
No. And remembering that you're not alone in the grief can be a powerful source of hope as well. Humans have been experiencing and surviving loss since the beginning of time. And, you know, there is wisdom and support available when you're ready and willing to accept it.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, what final thoughts would you like to share with our listeners who might be in the midst of grief right now? You want to go, Angela?
I guess be gentle with yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Grief isn't a weakness. It's the price of loving somebody deeply.
Yeah.
And, you know, while the acute pain won't last forever, rushing the process isn't going to help.
Nope.
And we kind of have to just trust the process and trust that moving through grief, however messy, is not linear. And, you know, the path of healing is going to come.
Right. And I would even add, don't hesitate to reach out for support from friends, family, support groups, hospices. Every hospice has bereavement programs. Even if your loved one was not on hospice, it was a traumatic death. We are still out there. All hospices offer that too. So we have bereavement support groups that you can join. There are all sorts of ways to connect. Some people need that privacy of connecting outside of their normal support systems. And so this gives them space to do that. So don't hesitate to reach for support, because connection is healing.
So even if they're not in hospice, they can still reach out to... Okay.
I think that's important information to know, because people just associate hospice with terminal care. You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, well, that's not me.
Our bereavement coordinators, I can speak for the hospices I've worked with, but our bereavement coordinators are phenomenal. And if they feel your grief is at a place where you need more help, like you're in that stuck or there's an issue or more mental health challenges, they'll literally connect you to providers to help you process through that as well. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. Thank you both for this profound conversation. To our listeners, we hope that this discussion has validated your experiences and offered some guidance for your journey. Next week, Angela and I are going to continue our Why Me series with a focus on chronic illness, injury, and pain. Until then, be gentle with yourselves and each other. This is Back to Life. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories about this series that we're talking about. You can follow us online at our website or on socials, and information about that is in the show notes. Be well.